Standing at the edge of a sheer cliff in Alaska's rugged wilderness, Mike Davidson felt his heart stop. Below him, a terrified bear cub clung desperately to a narrow ledge, its tiny claws scraping against the rock face as it let out heartbreaking cries for help. What happened in the next few hours would not only test the limits of human courage, but would lead to an extraordinary series of events that would change Mike's life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the incredible true story of how one man's split-second decision to save a helpless creature sparked a chain of mysterious occurrences that scientists still struggle to explain to this day. The crisp morning air bit at Mike Davidson's face as he adjusted his heavy camera equipment, carefully navigating the rocky terrain of Alaska's Kenai Mountains. The renowned wildlife photographer had spent the last decade capturing the raw beauty of North America's last frontier, but something felt different about this spring morning. Sunlight filtered through the towering spruce trees, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor as he made his way along the lesser-known trail that would lead him to what locals called Eagle's Watch, a precipitous overlook that offered unparalleled views of the valley below. At 43, Mike had built a reputation for catching moments that other photographers only dreamed of. The perfect arch of a leaping salmon, the intense gaze of a hunting wolf, the tender interaction between a mother moose and her calf. His work had graced the covers of National Geographic and Wild Alaska, earning him both acclaim and the freedom to choose his projects carefully. But lately, he'd felt an inexplicable pull towards something more significant, something that would truly make a difference in wildlife conservation. The trail grew steeper as Mike ascended, his boots crunching against loose gravel and patches of lingering spring snow. His backpack held not only his precious camera gear, but also climbing equipment, a habit he'd developed after years of pursuing the perfect shot in precarious locations. The morning silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a distant eagle and the whisper of wind through the ancient spruce needles. As he rounded a particularly challenging bend, Mike paused to catch his breath, taking in the magnificent vista before him. The valley stretched out like a painted canvas, still touched by morning mist, with the braided rivers below appearing like silver ribbons threading through the landscape. He had chosen this location after months of research, following rumors of a rare species of black bear that supposedly inhabited these remote reaches of the Kenai Peninsula. Mike checked his GPS coordinates and consulted the worn map he'd marked with potential wildlife hotspots. He was close to his intended destination, a series of caves that local indigenous guides had mentioned might serve as denning sites for the bears he sought to document. The project was part of a larger conservation effort to protect these lesser-known habitats from encroaching development. The photographer's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began setting up his first camera trap of the day. Years in the field had taught him patience. The best shots often came after hours or even days of waiting. As he worked, his mind wandered to the stories he'd heard from the Dena'ina people about these mountains. They spoke of bears that possessed an almost supernatural connection to the land, guardians of ancient secrets hidden within the rocky fortress of the Kenai Range. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Mike continued his ascent, each step calculated on the increasingly treacherous terrain. His boots found purchase on narrow ledges, his hands occasionally reaching out to steady himself against the cool rock. Face The air grew thinner, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow from the higher peaks and the earthy aroma of spring vegetation awakening from its winter slumber. Lost in his thoughts and focused on his footing, Mike almost missed the first sign that something was amiss. It was subtle, a change in the air, a shift in the mountain's breath. Then he heard it, a sound that would alter the course of his life, forever. A high-pitched cry, barely audible above the whisper of the wind, but unmistakably one of distress. Mike froze, his senses suddenly heightened, every fiber of his being tuned to that sound that seemed to pull at something deep within. His soul. The cry came again, clearer this time, carrying with it a note of desperate urgency that made Mike's heart race. He carefully set down his camera gear, securing it against a sturdy boulder, and moved closer to the cliff's edge. The sound led him to a precarious overlook, where the ground fell away into a dizzying drop. What he saw there made his blood run cold. A sight that would test not only his courage, but his very understanding of the connection between humans and the wild creatures they share this world with. Clinging precariously to a narrow ledge, no wider than a bookshelf, a small black bear cub trembled against the sheer rock face. The tiny creature, probably no more than a few months old, had somehow become trapped on this deadly perch, with at least 100-foot drop below to the jagged rocks and rushing river. Mike's experienced eye quickly assessed the situation. The cub had likely been exploring with its mother when it slipped or wandered too far, ending up in this desperate predicament. The cub's dark eyes, wide with fear, darted frantically around. As it searched for an escape route, its tiny claws scraped against the rock, creating a heart-wrenching sound that mixed with its plaintive cries. The ledge it stood on was beginning to crumble, small pieces of rock occasionally breaking free and plummeting into the abyss below. Time was clearly running out for the helpless animal. Mike's mind raced as he considered his options. His satellite phone had no signal in this remote location, and even if it did, help would take hours to arrive, hours the cub didn't have. The nearest ranger station was at least 20 miles away, and the local rescue teams weren't equipped for this kind of wildlife emergency. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he realized he was this creature's only hope for survival. Drawing from years of wilderness experience, Mike quickly surveyed the cliff face. The rock was predominantly granite, weathered by centuries of harsh Alaskan winters, creating both challenges and potential handholds. The descent would be about 30 feet to reach the cub's position, with the most treacherous section being the final 10 feet, where the rock face became almost completely vertical. His hands trembled slightly as he opened his backpack, grateful for his habit of carrying climbing gear. He pulled out a length of sturdy rope, carabiners, and his emergency harness. Equipment he'd used countless times to get the perfect shot, but never for a rescue like this. The gravity of what he was considering hit him full force. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and he could end up joining the cub in its dire situation, or worse. As Mike began securing his rope to a thick, gnarled spruce tree that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil, his mind flickered to the mother bear. She had to be somewhere nearby, and the thought of her returning to find him near her cub sent a chill down his spine. Adult black bears were generally less aggressive than grizzlies, but a mother protecting her cub was a force of nature that demanded respect and fear. The cub let out another cry, this one weaker than before, snapping Mike back to the urgency. of the situation. He couldn't wait any longer. After double and triple checking his knots and anchor points, he began preparing his rescue equipment. From his camera bag, he retrieved a soft carrying case he sometimes used for transporting his lenses. It would have to serve as a makeshift sling for the cub, assuming he could even get close enough to use it. Mike's heart pounded against his ribs as he secured the harness around his waist and thighs. Each buckle clicked into place with a finality that seemed to echo across the mountain face. The wind had picked up, causing his rope to sway slightly, adding another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. He took several deep breaths, trying to calm his racing thoughts and focus on the task ahead. The memory of his father's words from long ago surfaced in his mind. Nature gives us opportunities to prove our humanity. His dad, a former park ranger, had taught him everything he knew about wilderness survival and respect for wildlife. What would he do in this situation? The answer came clearly. He would try to save the cub, regardless of the risk. Taking one final look at his equipment and securing his makeshift cub carrier to his belt, Mike began his descent. The first few feet were straightforward, with good handholds and solid footing. But as he moved lower, the challenge increased. The rock face became more sheer, and the wind seemed to strengthen, as if the mountain itself was testing his resolve. The cub watched his approach, pressing itself harder against the rock wall. Its cries had subsided to whimpers, either from exhaustion or fear of this strange creature rappelling down toward it. Mike could now see that it was even younger than he'd initially thought, its fur still carrying the fuzzy softness of early cubhood. The sight only strengthened his determination to complete this rescue, regardless of the consequences. As Mike carefully navigated the final few feet toward the ledge, loose rocks clattered down the cliff face, disappearing into the void below. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sound served as a stark reminder of the fate that awaited both him and the cub if anything went wrong. The ledge was now barely 10 feet away, but these last few meters would prove to be the most challenging and dangerous part of his descent. Mike meticulously checked his harness one final time, his fingers tracing each strap and buckle with practiced precision. The weight of the decision he was about to make pressed heavily on his mind as he assessed the crumbling ledge where the frightened cub remained trapped. His years of experience in wildlife photography had taught him to respect the unpredictable nature of both animals and the wilderness. But this situation demanded immediate action despite the risks. The morning sun now cast harsh shadows across the cliff face, making it more difficult to judge distances and secure proper footing. Mike could feel sweat beginning to form on his palms, despite the cool mountain air, and he wiped them carefully on his jacket before gripping the rope. The cub's occasional whimpers served as a constant reminder of the urgency of his task, each sound tugging at his conscience with increasing intensity. Drawing from his climbing experience, Mike began planning his approach. The rock face presented several challenges: a section of loose shale that could give way under any pressure, a sharp overhang that would force him to swing out away from the wall, and the narrow ledge itself, which seemed to be slowly crumbling under the cub's weight. He would need to time his movements perfectly to avoid startling the young bear while maintaining his own safety. "Easy there, little one," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that whipped around the cliff. The cub's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it remained pressed against the rock wall, too terrified to move. Its small frame shook visibly, and Mike could see its chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. The sight strengthened his resolve. He couldn't wait any longer. Securing his position with a backup anchor point, Mike began preparing the makeshift carrier he'd fashioned from his camera bag. He removed the padding and adjusted the straps to create a secure cradle that could hold the cub during the ascent. The modification took precious minutes, during which small pieces of the ledge continued to break away and tumble into the abyss below. Mike's mind raced through all the possible scenarios. The cub could panic and try to escape, potentially falling to its death. It could attack him out of fear, causing him to lose his grip or balance. The mother could return at any moment, turning an already dangerous situation into a potentially fatal one. Yet despite all these risks, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to save this helpless creature. The wind picked up again, causing the rope to sway slightly. Mike waited for a momentary lull before beginning his final approach. He carefully tested each handhold and foothold, hyper-aware that any mistake could be catastrophic. The rough granite surface offered decent grip, but the morning dew had left patches of rock treacherously slick. His movements were deliberate and measured, each shift in position carefully calculated. As he drew closer, the cub's fear became more palpable. Its dark eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Mike's approaching figure. The young bear let out a series of short, high-pitched whimpers that cut through the mountain air like a knife. Mike could now see that it was a male cub, probably no more than 3 months old, far too young to survive on its own, even if it somehow escaped its current predicament. "It's okay, buddy," Mike continued, speaking in soft, soothing tones, hoping to calm both the cub and his own racing heart. The last few feet to the ledge seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Every muscle in his body tensed as he prepared for the most crucial part of his approach. One wrong move here could spell disaster for both of them. The ledge was now barely 2 feet away. Mike could see small cracks spreading through the rock where the cub stood, indicating that the entire outcropping could give way at any moment. He needed to act fast, but rushing could be equally catastrophic. Time seemed to slow as he made his final calculations, planning exactly how he would secure the cub without causing either of them to fall. Taking a deep breath, Mike anchored himself as securely as possible and reached for the makeshift carrier. The cub watched his every movement, its small body trembling uncontrollably. The wind had died down momentarily, giving him a brief window of optimal conditions. It was now or never. As he prepared to make his final move, Mike silently prayed that his years of experience in the wilderness had prepared him adequately for this moment. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. Not just the physical danger, but the responsibility he felt toward this young life hanging literally on the edge of existence. In all his years photographing wildlife, Mike had maintained a strict policy of non-intervention, believing that nature should take its course without human interference. But something about this situation felt different, as if he was meant to be here at this precise moment, meant to make this choice. With painstaking precision, Mike extended the makeshift carrier toward the trembling cub. His muscles strained. Against the awkward angle, every fiber in his body working to maintain perfect balance while suspended against the cliff face. The rough granite pressed against his chest as he inched closer, the texture of the rock biting through his jacket, serving as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of his position. The cub's reaction was immediate and heart-wrenching. It pressed itself even harder against the rock wall, its tiny claws scraping desperately against the stone as it tried to make itself smaller. The sound of its whimpers grew more intense, a high-pitched keening that seemed to echo off the cliff face. Mike froze in position, knowing that any sudden movement could push the terrified creature into a panic. "Easy there, little guy," Mike whispered, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm not going to hurt you." He remained perfectly still, allowing the cub to adjust to his presence. Years of wildlife photography had taught him the importance of patience when dealing with frightened animals. The next few moments would be crucial. He needed the cub to accept his presence before he could attempt the rescue. The wind picked up again, causing Mike's rope to sway slightly. He adjusted his position, the movement slow and deliberate, never taking his eyes off the cub. The ledge continued to crumble beneath the bear's weight, small pieces of rock breaking free and disappearing into the void below. Time was running out, but rushing could prove fatal for both of them. Mike began, humming softly, a technique he'd learned years ago while photographing nervous wildlife. The low, constant sound seemed to have a calming effect on the cub, its frantic breathing slowly steadying. The young bear's eyes remained fixed on Mike, but the raw panic in them began to fade, replaced by what looked almost like curiosity. Taking advantage of this moment of calm, Mike carefully maneuvered the carrier closer. The cub flinched, but didn't retreat further. There was nowhere left to go. The ledge had deteriorated significantly during these tense minutes, now barely wide enough to support the cub's weight. Small cracks were spreading through the rock like spider webs, a clear warning that the entire outcropping could give way at any moment. With agonizing slowness, Mike closed the final distance between them. He could now see every detail of the cub's face, its wet nose twitching as it caught his scent, the way its ears flattened against its head in fear, the subtle tremors that ran through its small frame. The cub was even younger than he had initially thought, probably only recently emerged from its winter den. Just as Mike prepared to make his final move, a sharp crack split the air. A section of the ledge broke away, causing the cub to scramble desperately for purchase. Without thinking, Mike lunged forward, his free hand shooting out to steady himself against the cliff face, while the other moved to secure the carrier around the panicked cub. The next few seconds were a blur of action. The cub, terrified by the crumbling ledge, practically leaped into the carrier, its survival instinct overriding its fear of the strange human. Mike quickly secured the straps, his fingers working with automatic precision despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The remainder of the ledge gave way completely, disappearing into the chasm below mere moments after he'd pulled the cub to safety. The young bear, now safely enclosed in the makeshift carrier, pressed against Mike's chest, its tiny heart pounding so hard he could feel it through the fabric. The weight of the cub, though not substantial, altered his balance significantly. Mike took a moment to steady himself, adjusting his position on the rope to compensate for the additional load. A new sound caught his attention, a distant rustling from somewhere above. Mike's blood ran cold as he realized what it might mean. The mother bear had to be somewhere nearby, and the cub's cries during the rescue might have finally drawn her attention. He needed to get them both back to solid ground, and quickly. The ascent would be even more challenging than the descent. Not only was he now carrying precious cargo, but the possibility of an encounter with the mother bear added a new level of urgency to the situation. Mike began the climb, each movement carefully calculated to maintain stability while protecting the cub secured against his chest. The young bear had grown surprisingly quiet, as if sensing the importance of remaining still during their precarious journey upward. Its warm weight against Mike's chest served as both a comfort and a reminder of the responsibility he'd taken on. The cub's trust, given so suddenly in that moment of crisis, felt like a sacred bond, one he was determined to honor by getting them both to safety. Mike's muscles screamed in protest as he continued the ascent, each movement more challenging than the last. The added weight of the cub threw off his usual climbing rhythm, forcing him to readjust his technique with every upward motion. Sweat trickled down his back, despite the cool mountain air, his breath coming in controlled but labored gasps as he fought against gravity and exhaustion. The distant sounds from above grew more distinct, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. Mike's heart raced faster, but he forced himself to maintain his methodical pace. Rushing now could prove fatal for both him and his precious cargo. The cub remained remarkably still in its makeshift carrier, its warm weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. 20 feet of sheer cliff face still separated them from safety. Mike's fingers searched for each handhold, testing every grip before committing his weight. The rough granite had already worn through his skin in places, leaving his fingertips raw and bleeding. He ignored the pain, focusing instead on the rhythmic movement of climb test secure, climb test secure. The mantra helped keep his growing panic at bay. A sudden gust of wind slammed him against the rock face, causing the rope to sway dangerously. The cub let out a frightened whimper, pressing closer against Mike's chest. The sound echoed off the cliff walls, seeming to amplify in the mountain air. Mike froze, his muscles trembling with the effort of maintaining position, listening intently for any response from above. The answering roar that came made his blood run cold. It was close, far too close, and carried the unmistakable fury of a mother bear protecting her young. Mike could now hear heavy footfalls approaching the cliff edge, accompanied by the sound of rocks being dislodged. Small stones began raining down around him, a warning of what was to come. "Hold on, little one," Mike whispered to the cub, his voice hoarse with exertion. He began climbing faster, knowing that reaching the top before the mother bear arrived was now his only chance. His muscles protested the increased pace, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. 15 feet to go, then 12. Each foot gained felt like a small victory. The rain of rocks intensified, some now large enough to cause serious injury if they struck true. Mike pressed himself as close to the cliff face as possible, trying to minimize their exposure. The cub trembled against him, but remained remarkably quiet, as if understanding the need for silence. A particularly large stone grazed Mike's shoulder, causing him to gasp in pain, but he maintained his grip. 10 feet from the top, disaster struck. A falling rock struck his right hand directly, sending shocking pain through his fingers. His grip faltered, and for one heart-stopping moment they began to fall. The safety rope caught them with a violent jerk, causing them to slam against the cliff face. The impact drove the air from Mike's lungs and sent waves of pain through his injured hand. The cub cried out in fear, its small body shaking violently in the carrier. The sound seemed to energize Mike, pushing him past the pain and exhaustion. He couldn't fail now, couldn't let this tiny life end here on this unforgiving cliff face. Using mainly his left hand, he began climbing again, each movement a testament to sheer willpower over physical limitation. The mother bear's roars grew, louder, now accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against rock. She was trying to find a way down to them. Mike could picture her massive form looming above, driven by maternal instinct to reach her cub at any cost. The thought spurred him on, his movements becoming more desperate, but no less precise. 5 feet remained. Mike's vision had narrowed to the rock directly in front of him, his world reduced to the next handhold, the next push upward. His injured hand had gone numb, forcing him to rely heavily on his left side. The cub's weight seemed to have doubled, though he knew it was just his own fatigue making everything feel heavier. The edge was now within reach. Mike gathered his remaining strength for one final push, knowing these last few feet would be the most dangerous. The mother bear would be waiting, and he had no way to defend himself while climbing. His only hope was to get the cub to safety quickly enough to avoid her wrath. With a surge of desperate energy, Mike lunged upward, grabbing the cliff edge with his good hand. His muscles trembled as he pulled himself and the cub over the rim, rolling away from the edge in one fluid motion. As he scrambled to his feet, his worst fears were realized. There, not 20 feet away, stood the mother bear, her massive form silhouetted against the morning sun, her eyes fixed directly on him and her cub. Every fiber of Mike's being screamed at him to run, but he knew that would only trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Instead, he forced himself to move slowly, carefully working to unfasten the carrier containing her cub. His injured hand throbbed with renewed intensity as he fumbled with the straps, each second feeling like an eternity under the mother bear's unwavering gaze. The mother bear's presence dominated the small clearing, her massive form casting a long shadow in the morning light. Mike's fingers worked steadily at the carrier's straps despite his racing heart, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger her protective instincts. The cub, sensing its mother's presence, began to squirm with renewed energy, letting out small whimpers that seemed to echo in the tense silence. The distance between Mike and the mother bear felt impossibly small. Her dark eyes, intelligent and fierce, never left his movements as he carefully loosened the final strap. The morning breeze carried her wild scent, a mixture of earth, pine, and something primitively powerful that made every human instinct scream for flight. But Mike forced himself to remain calm, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of wildlife photography had taught Mike to read animal behavior, and what he saw in the mother bear's stance was unlike anything he'd encountered before. While her powerful muscles were tensed for action, there was something almost hesitant in her posture. She made no aggressive moves forward, no threatening displays of power. Instead, she watched, her head slightly tilted, as if assessing the situation with an intelligence that transcended mere animal instinct. Finally, the last strap came free. Mike slowly knelt, placing the carrier on the ground with infinite care. The cub immediately scrambled out, its small form tumbling in its haste to reach its mother. Mike remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow, as the young bear covered the distance between them. The mother bear's attention shifted to her cub, her massive head lowering to inspect her offspring. The reunion that followed struck Mike with its raw emotional power. The mother bear gently nuzzled her cub, making soft sounds that carried clearly in the mountain air. The cub pressed against her legs, its earlier fear forgotten in the joy of reunion. Mike watched, transfixed, as the massive predator displayed a tenderness that rivaled any human mother's love. Then something extraordinary happened. The mother Bear raised her head and met Mike's gaze again, but this time there was no fury in her eyes. She made a soft huffing sound, not threatening, but almost like a sigh. The cub, now secure between its mother's front legs, turned to look at Mike as well. The tableau held for several heartbeats, man and bears connected by something that defied explanation. Mike remained motionless, barely breathing, as the mother bear took a step forward. His survival instincts screamed at him to retreat, but something deeper held him in place. The massive animal moved with surprising grace, closing half the distance between them. She paused, raised her head, and did something that would haunt Mike's dreams for years to come. She nodded, a single deliberate movement that seemed impossible in its human-like intention. The gesture lasted only a moment, but its impact hit Mike like a physical force. In that brief exchange, he felt a connection that transcended the natural barrier between human and wild animal. The mother bear's eyes held his for one more moment, conveying something that seemed almost like gratitude, before she turned away. With her cub following close behind, she moved toward the forest's edge, her powerful form soon disappearing among the trees. Mike's legs finally gave out, and he sank to the ground, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. His injured hand throbbed painfully, reminding him of the physical toll of the rescue. But his mind was fixed on what had just occurred, not just the successful rescue, but that impossible moment of connection with one of nature's most powerful predators. As his heartbeat slowly returned to normal, Mike became aware of his surroundings again. The morning sun had risen higher, bathing the clearing in warm light. Birds had resumed their songs, and a gentle breeze stirred the pine needles overhead. The normal rhythms of the forest were returning, as if the extraordinary events of the past hour had been nothing but a dream. But the reality of what had happened was evidenced by his torn clothing, his bleeding hand, and the makeshift carrier. Lying empty on the ground, Mike slowly gathered his equipment, his movements stiff from the ordeal. His camera gear, left secured near the cliff edge, had survived unscathed, though photography seemed trivial now compared to what he had just experienced. As he prepared to leave the clearing, Mike noticed something unusual near where the bears had disappeared into the forest. Moving closer, he found fresh claw marks on a tree trunk, not the usual territorial scratches bears left, but something different. The marks formed a distinct pattern, almost like a symbol, that seemed to have been deliberately placed at human eye level. Mike stared at it, a chill running down his spine as he sensed that his encounter with these bears was far from over. The next few days passed in a blur as Mike recovered from his cliffside ordeal. His injured hand had required several stitches at the local medical clinic, and the doctor had ordered him to rest for at least a week. But rest proved elusive as his mind constantly returned to that extraordinary moment with the mother bear. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her intelligent gaze, that impossible nod of acknowledgement that defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The first strange occurrence happened 3 nights after the rescue. Mike had been sitting on his cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the Alaskan sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The evening was peaceful, the air crisp with the lingering chill of early spring. Then he noticed something unusual, a perfect line of freshly dug earth leading from the forest's edge to his porch steps. Upon closer inspection, he found small, bright red berries carefully placed along the trail, each one positioned with what seemed like deliberate precision. Mike knew these berries. They were lingonberries, a favorite food of black bears, but they weren't in season yet. These looked fresh, as if they had been recently gathered from some secret place deep in the wilderness. The arrangement was too perfect to be natural, too intentional to be coincidence. A shiver ran down his spine as he recalled the strange claw marks he'd seen after the rescue. The next morning, he found more signs. Fresh bear tracks circled his cabin, but they weren't the random patterns of a bear simply passing through. These tracks formed perfect circles around his home, like some kind of protective boundary. What struck him most was their size. They matched exactly with the mother bear's prints he'd photographed after the rescue. Mike's reputation as a wildlife photographer had been built on his scientific mindset and rational approach to documenting nature. But these occurrences challenged everything he believed about wild animal behavior. He began keeping a detailed journal of the strange events, his photographer's eye capturing every detail with clinical precision. A week after the rescue, he woke to find a fresh catch of salmon arranged neatly on his porch. 3 fish, perfectly aligned, without a single bite taken from them. In all his years studying bears, he'd never heard of such behavior. Bears were opportunistic feeders, never leaving food untouched. Yet here was what appeared to be an offering, deliberately left for him to find. The incidents continued, each more inexplicable than the last. Small bundles of medicinal plants, the same types local indigenous healers used for treating wounds, appeared near his door. The timing seemed significant, as his injured hand was still healing. The plants were arranged with what appeared to be purposeful care, their healing properties exactly what he needed for his recovery. Mike began sharing his observations with Dr. Sarah Winters, a local wildlife biologist he'd worked with on previous projects. At first, she was skeptical, suggesting rational explanations for each occurrence. But when she visited his cabin and saw the evidence firsthand, the perfectly arranged offerings, the systematic tracks, the consistent patterns, her scientific curiosity was piqued. "This goes beyond normal bear behavior," Dr. Winters admitted, examining the latest set of tracks. "There's intelligence here, purpose, but it challenges everything we know about ursine cognitive capabilities." She took samples and measurements, promising to document everything for further study. The local Dena'ina elders, when consulted, were less surprised. They spoke of ancient stories about guardian bears, protectors of the land who formed special bonds with humans who proved worthy of their trust. Mike had initially approached these tales with polite skepticism, but now he found himself revisiting them with new eyes. 2 weeks after the rescue, Mike was awakened in the middle of the night by a soft scratching sound outside his cabin. Approaching the window cautiously, he saw a sight that made his heart skip a beat. The mother bear stood in the moonlight, her massive form casting a long shadow across his yard. The cub played near her feet, noticeably stronger and more energetic than when he'd rescued it. The bears made no attempt to hide their presence. The mother bear's gaze met his through the window, holding that same intelligent awareness he'd seen during their first encounter. She moved with deliberate grace to a nearby tree, and as Mike watched in amazement, began marking it with her claws. The pattern she created was similar to the one he'd seen after the rescue, but more complex, almost like a primitive form of communication. Mike remained at the window, transfixed, as the bears continued their nocturnal visit. The cub, apparently, remembering him, approached the cabin's porch without fear, leaving small paw prints in the soft earth. The mother bear watched calmly, showing none of the protective aggression typical of her species. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, they melted back into the forest shadows, leaving Mike with a profound sense that he had witnessed something beyond ordinary natural behavior. The next morning, examining the fresh claw marks by daylight, Mike felt a deep conviction that these bears were trying to tell him something. The question was, what were they trying to communicate, and why had they chosen him to receive their message? As he traced the intricate patterns with his fingers, he sensed that his life had become entwined with these creatures in ways he was only beginning to understand. Mike's experience with the bears began drawing attention from unexpected quarters. Dr. Winters had shared her preliminary findings with colleagues at the University of Alaska, and soon researchers from various fields were requesting visits to study the phenomena. The claw marks particularly intrigued anthropologists, who noted similarities to ancient petroglyphs found in sacred sites throughout the region. Among the interested parties was James Running Wolf, a respected Dena'ina elder and cultural historian. When he arrived at Mike's cabin, his weathered face creased with concern as he examined the marks. "These patterns," he said, running his fingers over the grooves in the bark, "they're not random. They're similar to symbols found in a sacred cave system our people have known about for generations." The mention of caves sparked Mike's interest immediately. He remembered the research he'd done before his fateful encounter with the bears about potential denning sites in the area. "Could you show me these caves?" he asked, trying to keep the excitement from his voice. Running Wolf studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "The caves aren't marked on any modern maps," the elder explained as they hiked through the dense forest the next morning. "Our people have kept their locations secret to protect them from vandals and treasure hunters. But what's happening here?" "Dudu," he gestured to the fresh bear tracks crossing their path. "This feels like a sign. The bears are choosing to reveal something." The journey took them deep into a part of the wilderness Mike had never explored, despite his years photographing. The area, Running Wolf moved with surprising agility for his age, following trails that were barely visible to Mike's experienced eye. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the elder shared stories passed down through generations about the special relationship between his people and the bears. "Our ancestors spoke of guardian bears," Running Wolf explained, pausing to catch his breath near a crystal-clear stream. "Bears that were more than just animals. They were protectors of the land and keepers of ancient wisdom. They would choose certain individuals to share their knowledge with, but only those who proved themselves worthy through acts of compassion and courage." Mike thought about the mother bear's behavior since the rescue, the offerings, the protective circles around his cabin, the deliberate attempts at communication. Could there be truth to these ancient stories? His rational mind struggled with the concept, but his experiences over the past weeks had already challenged everything he thought. He knew about wildlife behavior. After several hours of hiking, they reached a rocky outcropping that seemed unremarkable at first glance. Running Wolf moved some branches aside, revealing a narrow opening in the rock face. "Few people know about this entrance," he said, pulling out a flashlight. "The main cave system is actually quite extensive, but this particular chamber is special." As they squeezed through the tight opening, Mike's nostrils filled with the musty scent of ancient stone. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their footsteps echoed off unseen walls. Running Wolf's flashlight beam revealed a passage that gradually widened into a larger chamber. When they reached it, the elder's light played across the walls, and Mike gasped. The cave walls were covered in petroglyphs, hundreds of them extending from floor to ceiling. But what made Mike's heart race were the similarities between these ancient markings and the patterns the mother bear had been leaving near his cabin. Some were nearly identical, down to the smallest detail. "These markings tell a story," Running Wolf said softly, his voice filled with reverence. "They speak of a time when bears and humans worked together as guardians of the land. The bears would choose human partners, usually those who had shown great respect for nature or had helped them in some way. These partnerships were considered sacred." Mike moved closer to the wall, his photographer's eye noting every detail. Among the petroglyphs were scenes depicting humans and bears together, facing various challenges, natural disasters, threats to the forest, changes in the land. In one scene, a human figure appeared to be receiving something from a bear, some kind of knowledge or power, represented by swirling lines between them. "The last recorded partnership was over 200 years ago," Running Wolf continued. "Many thought these stories were just legends, but what you've described, what the mother bear is doing." He turned to Mike, his eyes intense in the flashlight's beam. "You may be experiencing something that hasn't happened in generations." As if in response to his words, they heard a sound echo through the cave, a familiar huffing noise that made Mike's spine tingle. The mother bear's unique vocalization. Running Wolf's flashlight beam darted toward the cave entrance, but nothing was visible in the darkness. Yet both men knew they had heard it. "She's watching us," Running Wolf said quietly. "She knows we're here. This is no coincidence, Mike. The bears led you to save that cub for a reason. They're trying to tell us something important, something urgent. In our stories, the guardian bears only revealed themselves in times of great need, when the land itself was in danger." Mike remembered the mother bear's intelligent gaze, the deliberate way she had been trying to communicate. What was she trying to tell him? What threat could be so significant that it would bridge the gap between human and animal in this extraordinary way? As these questions filled his mind, a cool breeze swept through the cave, carrying with it the distinct scent of spring earth and pine, the same scent he associated with the mother bear. The journey back from the sacred cave seemed to take on a dream-like quality as Mike and Running Wolf navigated the deepening twilight. The forest had grown unusually quiet, with only their footsteps and the occasional distant cry of a raven breaking the silence. Mike's mind raced with everything they had discovered, the ancient petroglyphs, their striking similarity to the mother bear's markings, and the implications of what it all might mean. They had spent hours in the cave, documenting every marking and symbol with Mike's camera. Running Wolf had translated what he could, revealing a complex system of communication between bears and humans that stretched back centuries. Some of the petroglyphs seemed to be warnings, others appeared to be maps, and still others depicted what looked like future events. Natural disasters, changes in the landscape, and various threats to the forest's existence. As they approached a clearing, Running Wolf suddenly froze, raising his hand for silence. Ahead of them, barely visible in the fading light, was a scene that made Mike's blood run cold. The ground had been torn up by heavy machinery. Recent tracks that hadn't been there during their hike up to the cave. Fresh surveyors' stakes marked the earth, their bright orange ribbons fluttering in the evening breeze like warning flags. "Development!" Running Wolf spat the word like a curse. "They're planning something big. He knelt to examine the tracks more closely. These are recent, within the last few hours. They must have come while we were in the cave. His weathered face was grave as he stood, brushing dirt from his hands. This is protected land, or at least it's supposed to be. Mike pulled out his camera, methodically photographing the evidence of intrusion. His years as a wildlife photographer had taught him the importance of documentation. "Do you think this is what the bears have been trying to warn us about?" he asked, capturing images of the surveyor's stakes and tire tracks. "It would make sense," Running Wolf replied, his voice heavy with concern. "In our stories, the guardian bears always appeared when the land was threatened. They would choose human partners who could help protect the forest." He paused, studying the devastation before them. "But this is different from the threats of the past. This is about money and power." As if in response to their conversation, a low growl emanated from the forest's edge. The mother bear emerged from the shadows, her massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Her cub followed close behind, but this time they weren't alone. To Mike's astonishment, 2 more adult bears appeared, moving with the same deliberate grace he had come to associate with the mother bear. Running Wolf inhaled sharply. "More guardians," he whispered. "This is unprecedented. In all our stories, they never appeared in groups like this." The bears moved forward in perfect synchronization, their movements almost ceremonial. They approached the area of devastation, examining the machinery tracks and surveyors' stakes with what appeared to be deliberate interest. The mother bear then did something extraordinary. She began systematically removing the surveyors' stakes, pulling them from the ground with powerful swipes of her paws. The other bears joined her, working with an efficiency that seemed almost human. The cub watched from a safe distance, occasionally attempting to mimic the adult's actions. Mike raised his camera, his photographer's instincts taking over, but Running Wolf gently lowered it. "Some things shouldn't be documented," the elder said softly. "Some things need to remain sacred." Mike nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. Instead, they watched in respectful silence as the bears completed their task. When the last stake had been removed, the mother bear approached them. She carried something in her mouth, a piece of paper that had been attached to one of the stakes. With deliberate care, she placed it on the ground at Mike's feet. It was a permit application, partially torn, but still legible, from a company called Northern Resource Development Corporation. Running Wolf picked up the paper, his expression darkening as he read. "They're planning a mining operation," he said, grimly. "Rare earth minerals. They must have found deposits in these mountains." He looked up at the bears, who stood watching them intently. "This is what they've been trying to tell us. The forest isn't just under threat, it's about to be destroyed." The implications hit Mike like a physical blow. The area's delicate ecosystem, the sacred caves, the ancient relationship between humans and bears, all of it would be obliterated if the mining operation went forward. He thought about the petroglyphs they had discovered, centuries of history and wisdom that would be lost forever. The mother bear moved closer, her eyes meeting Mike's with that same intelligent awareness he had come to know. In that moment, he understood what she had been preparing him for. The rescue of her cub hadn't been a random event. It had been a test, a way of determining if he was worthy of becoming a guardian himself. Running Wolf seemed to read his thoughts. "The choice is yours," the elder said quietly, "but know that if you accept this responsibility, your life will never be the same. The guardian bears don't choose their human partners lightly. They're asking you to stand with them, to fight for this land." As if confirming his words, the mother bear raised her massive head and let out a deep, resonant call that echoed through the mountains. The other bears joined her, their combined voices, creating a sound that seemed to make the very earth vibrate. The cub, still watching from the edge of the clearing, added its own small voice to the chorus. Mike felt something shift inside him, a deepening of the connection that had begun on that cliff face. He looked at the devastated clearing, then back at the bears who had chosen him to help them protect their home. His answer came without hesitation. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes to protect this place." The mother bear nodded, that same deliberate, impossible nod he had seen after the rescue. Then one by one, the bears melted back into the forest shadows, leaving Mike and Running Wolf alone with their newfound knowledge and purpose. The elder placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his touch conveying both support and warning. "The real challenge begins now," Running Wolf said as they resumed their journey back. "The corporation behind this has money and influence. They won't give up easily." He paused, looking back at where the bears had disappeared. "But neither will they, and neither will we." As they walked, Mike's mind was already racing with plans. His photographs and reputation could help bring attention to the threat. Running Wolf's knowledge of tribal laws and protected lands could provide legal leverage. And the bears. They had already shown they were willing to take direct action to protect their territory. The forest around them seemed more alive now, filled with purpose and ancient magic. Mike understood that he had become part of something far larger than himself, a partnership between humans and nature that stretched back through centuries. The mother bear had chosen him to help write the next chapter in that ongoing story, and he was determined not to let her down. Over the next few days, Mike and Running Wolf worked tirelessly to gather evidence of Northern Resource Development Corporation's illegal activities. Mike's photographs of the devastated clearing and the permit application recovered by the bears provided a starting point, but they needed more. Running Wolf's connections within the Tribal Council helped them access historical documents proving the land's protected status, while Mike's reputation as a respected wildlife photographer opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The bears continued their own form of surveillance, leaving signs and warnings that only Mike could now interpret. Each morning, he would find new claw marks around his cabin, their patterns increasingly urgent. Sometimes they led him to fresh evidence of corporate encroachment, hidden survey equipment, unmarked vehicles moving through restricted areas, or workers conducting unauthorized soil samples under cover of darkness. One particularly tense evening, Mike was reviewing his photographs when he heard an unusual commotion outside. The mother bear stood at the edge of his property, but something was different about her behavior. Her movements were agitated, and she kept looking back toward the forest with unusual urgency. Following her gaze, Mike noticed a faint orange glow in the distance, artificial light where there should be none. Grabbing his camera and a small pack of essential gear, Mike followed the bear into the darkness. She led him through paths he never knew existed, moving with silent purpose through the underbrush. After about 20 minutes of careful navigation, they came upon a hidden clearing where several large vehicles were parked. Men in corporate uniforms moved around the site, setting up drilling equipment under powerful floodlights. Mike's camera clicked silently as he documented the illegal operation. The mother bear remained beside him, her massive form providing both protection and a strange sense of partnership. Through his lens, he captured clear images of company logos, equipment, serial numbers, and most importantly, the faces of those involved. What they were doing was clearly unauthorized. No environmental impact studies, no proper permits, no tribal consultation. Suddenly the bear tensed beside him. Before Mike could react, voices approached their hiding spot. Two security guards, making their rounds with flashlights sweeping the perimeter. The mother bear moved with incredible stealth for her size, positioning herself between Mike and the approaching men. Her cub, who had followed at a distance, remained hidden in the shadows. The guards passed within feet of their position, but somehow failed to notice them. Mike held his breath, acutely aware that discovery could be disastrous. Once the immediate danger had passed, the mother bear led them back through the forest. By a different route, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. Back at his cabin, Mike immediately began processing the photographs, while Running Wolf made calls to tribal authorities and environmental protection agencies. The evidence they had gathered was damning. Clear violations of multiple federal and tribal laws. But both men knew that corporate lawyers would fight tooth and nail to discredit or suppress their findings. "We need to make this public," Running Wolf declared, studying one particularly incriminating photo. "Once it's out there, they can't hide it anymore." He paused, considering their options. "But we have to be smart about it. These people have resources we can't match." Mike nodded, understanding the risks. His career had taught him the power of images to shape public opinion, but also the danger of taking on powerful interests. "I have contacts at several major environmental organizations," he said, selecting key photographs for distribution. "And my reputation might help get their attention." That night, as Mike prepared his evidence for release, the bears made another unprecedented move. The mother bear appeared at his window, accompanied not just by her cub and the other guardian bears, but by an entire procession of wildlife. Wolves, moose, eagles, species that normally avoided each other, gathered in an impossible display of unity. The message was clear. The entire forest was mobilizing to defend itself. Running Wolf, who had stayed to help coordinate their efforts, watched the gathering with awe. "In our oldest stories," he said quietly, "there are tales of the great gatherings, when all creatures would come together in times of dire need. But no living person has ever seen such a thing." He turned to Mike, his expression grave. "What we're about to do, it's not just about stopping one mining operation. It's about preserving something ancient and sacred." The next morning, Mike's photographs and documentation were released simultaneously to major news outlets, environmental organizations, and social media platforms. The story exploded immediately. A renowned wildlife photographer exposing corporate illegal activities, backed by tribal authorities and environmental experts. The images of destroyed forest and illegal equipment struck a chord with the public. Northern Resource Development Corporation's response was swift and aggressive. Their lawyers issued immediate denials and threats of legal action. Corporate spokespersons appeared on news programs attempting to discredit Mike's evidence and paint him as an environmental extremist. But the truth in his photographs was undeniable, and public opinion quickly turned against the corporation. What the company's lawyers couldn't explain away were the increasingly strange events that began occurring at their work sites. Equipment would be found damaged or disabled, but in ways that seemed impossible for humans to accomplish. Survey stakes would vanish overnight, replaced by ancient-looking claw marks. Workers reported seeing unusually large bears moving in coordinated groups, displaying behavior that defied explanation. Mike continued documenting everything, but now with a deeper understanding of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a battle between environmentalists and corporations. It was an awakening of ancient powers, a resurgence of partnerships between humans and nature that had been lost to time. The mother bear and her fellow guardians were showing him that the forest had its own ways of fighting back. As pressure mounted on Northern Resource Development Corporation, Mike knew they had struck a significant blow in the fight to protect the forest. But he also sensed that this was just the beginning of a larger struggle. The mother bear's continued presence and the ongoing gathering of wildlife suggested that their role as guardians was far from over. Something fundamental was shifting in the relationship between humans and the wild, and Mike found himself at the heart of this transformation. The corporate pushback escalated faster than anyone anticipated. Within days of the story breaking, Mike found himself at the center of a fierce legal and media battle. Northern Resource Development Corporation's lawyers filed multiple lawsuits, claiming defamation and interference with business operations. Private investigators began appearing in town, asking questions about Mike's background and reliability. But what worried him most were the unmarked vehicles that now regularly patrolled the forest roads near his cabin. Running Wolf's tribal connections proved invaluable during this time. The council provided legal support and documentation proving the land's protected status dating back generations. Environmental organizations rallied to their cause, offering resources and media exposure. But the corporation's influence ran deep, and they soon discovered that several local officials had been quietly accepting corporate payments to look the other way. The mother bear and her companions seemed to sense the increasing pressure. Their activities became more overt, more difficult to dismiss as normal animal behavior. Work crews would arrive at sites to find their equipment arranged in perfect geometric patterns that no human could have created overnight. Security cameras consistently malfunctioned around the bears, capturing only brief glimpses of impossible, coordinated movements. One morning, Mike woke to find something extraordinary outside his cabin. The guardian bears had gathered in a perfect circle with the mother bear and her cub at the center. Between them lay a collection of objects that sent chills down his spine: ancient arrowheads, pottery shards, and what appeared to be ceremonial items, all carefully arranged. Running Wolf, examining the artifacts, confirmed they had come from deep within the sacred cave system, places no human had visited in living memory. "They're showing us proof," the elder explained, carefully documenting each item's position. "Evidence of the ancient partnership between bears and humans. They want us to understand that this fight is part of something much older." The artifacts would prove crucial in establishing the area's historical and cultural significance, adding another layer of legal protection to their cause. The corporation's next move was both unexpected and devastating. They released environmental impact studies, clearly falsified, claiming the area was already damaged by natural causes and that their mining operation would actually improve local wildlife conditions. They brought in their own experts, who dismissed Mike's photographs as misleading. and suggested the bear's unusual behavior was due to disease or environmental contamination. Most shocking was their announcement of a major economic development package for the region, promising jobs and prosperity to a community that had struggled with unemployment. The offer created divisions among locals, with some beginning to view Mike and Running Wolf as obstacles to progress. Anonymous threats began appearing, some directed at Mike's property, others at the bears themselves. But the guardian bears had their own response to these tactics. On the night of a crucial town hall meeting where corporate representatives were scheduled to present their development plan, something remarkable occurred. As residents gathered in the community center, the sound of bears, dozens of them, filled the air. The mother bear appeared at the hall's main window, clearly visible to everyone inside, with her cub by her side. Then, in full view of the stunned audience, she began making the same deliberate marks they had seen in the sacred cave. The bears emerged from the darkness, each adding to the pattern until a complex series of symbols covered the ground. Running Wolf, called to translate, identified them as ancient warnings about the destruction of sacred lands. The corporate representatives tried to dismiss the event, but their words rang hollow in the face of such an obvious display of intelligence and purpose. Local news crews captured everything on film, and soon the story of the guardian bears spread far beyond their small community. Wildlife experts and researchers began arriving from around the world, drawn by reports of bears displaying unprecedented behavioral patterns. Mike's photograph of the mother bear creating the symbols became iconic, a powerful symbol of nature's resistance to exploitation. Environmental activists adopted the bear's markings as symbols of their own movement. The corporation's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble in the face of public fascination with the guardian bears. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Winters, analyzing soil samples from areas the bears had marked, discovered high levels of toxic compounds that would be released by the proposed mining operation. The bears hadn't just been warning about the destruction of sacred land. They had been trying to prevent an environmental catastrophe. The revelation transformed the conflict. Environmental protection agencies, armed with this new evidence, suspended all of Northern Resource Development Corporation's permits, pending further investigation. The company's stock price plummeted as investors began questioning their methods and motives. Through it all, the mother bear maintained her vigilant presence near Mike's cabin. Her cub had grown stronger, more confident, often participating in the bear's coordinated activities. Mike continued documenting everything, building an unprecedented record of cooperation between humans and wildlife that challenged conventional understanding of animal behavior. Late one evening, as Mike reviewed his latest photographs, Running Wolf arrived with ancient tribal records he'd discovered in the council archives. The documents described similar conflicts from centuries past. Other times, when guardian bears had chosen human partners to help protect the land. In each case, the partnership had led to the preservation of crucial wilderness areas that remain protected to this day. This isn't just about stopping one mining operation, Running Wolf said, spreading the old papers carefully on Mike's table. The bears are showing us a different way of seeing our relationship with the natural world. They're reminding us of something we've forgotten. The mother bear, as if hearing his words, appeared at the window with her now familiar nod of acknowledgement. The battle for the forest was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. The guardian bears had awakened something in the collective consciousness, a memory of ancient partnerships between humans and nature that offered hope for a different future. As Mike watched the mother bear and her cub disappear into the gathering darkness, he knew they were all part of a story that would be told for generations to come. The turning point in their battle came from an unexpected direction. Early one morning, Mike received an urgent call from Dr. Winters. Her continued analysis of soil samples had revealed something even more alarming than the toxic compounds, evidence of an extensive underground water system that connected directly to the region's main aquifer. The proposed mining operation wouldn't just threaten the forest, it would risk contaminating the water supply for thousands of people across multiple communities. This discovery coincided with increasingly urgent behavior from the guardian bears. The mother bear began leading Mike and Running Wolf to specific locations throughout the forest, each one revealing new evidence of the land's ecological significance. They found rare plant species, previously undocumented wildlife breeding grounds, and most significantly, a series of natural springs that proved the extent of the underground water network. The bears' activities also took on a new dimension of sophistication. Working in coordinated groups, they began creating elaborate patterns visible from the air, arrangements of logs, stones, and natural materials that, when photographed by environmental survey planes, clearly marked the boundaries of the water system. These patterns matched ancient tribal maps that Running Wolf discovered, suggesting the bears had been preserving this knowledge for generations. Meanwhile, Northern Resource Development Corporation faced mounting pressure on multiple fronts. Anonymous whistleblowers from within the company began coming forward, revealing internal documents that showed executives had been aware of the environmental risks, but had chosen to suppress the information. The mother bear's prediction of danger, marked in those first warning symbols, was proving prophetic. Local opinion shifted dramatically as news of the water contamination risk spread. Former supporters of the mining project now joined the opposition, realizing their families' health could be at stake. The corporation's promises of economic prosperity seemed hollow compared to the threat of poisoned water supplies. Town Hall. Meetings, once dominated by corporate representatives, now filled with concerned citizens demanding answers. The guardian bear's influence extended beyond their immediate territory. Reports began coming in from other parts of the state, bears exhibiting similar coordinated behaviors, marking areas where environmental threats lurked beneath the surface. Wildlife researchers were baffled by what appeared to be a widespread awakening of ursine intelligence and purpose. Mike's documentation of these events attracted international attention. Environmental organizations and indigenous rights groups from around the world reached out, sharing similar stories of wildlife displaying unprecedented behaviors in response to environmental threats. The mother bear and her companions had sparked a global conversation about the relationship between humans and nature. One misty morning, as Mike photographed the bear's latest activities, he witnessed something extraordinary. The mother bear led a procession of wildlife to a previously undiscovered cave entrance. Inside, they found walls covered with pristine petroglyphs that perfectly matched the patterns the bears had been creating. Carbon dating would later reveal these markings to be thousands of years old, proof that the bear's knowledge had been preserved across countless generations. This discovery proved to be the final piece of evidence needed to secure permanent protection for the forest. State and federal authorities, faced with irrefutable proof of the area's historical, cultural, and ecological significance, designated the entire region as a protected sanctuary. Northern Resource Development Corporation, its reputation in tatters and facing multiple investigations, finally withdrew their mining proposals. The victory came with a deeper understanding of what the mother bear had been trying to teach them. All along, the ancient partnership between bears and humans wasn't just about protecting territory. It was about maintaining the delicate balance that sustained all life. Each marking, each coordinated action had been part of a larger message about the interconnectedness of all living things. Running Wolf worked with tribal authorities to establish a new conservation program, combining traditional knowledge with modern scientific research. The guardian bears became central figures in this effort, their continued presence a reminder of the sacred trust between humans and nature. Young people from the community began training as forest guardians, learning to read the bears' signs and understand their warnings. Dr. Winters established a research center dedicated to studying the unprecedented behaviors they had witnessed. The mother bear and her companions seemed to accept the scientific observation, even appearing to deliberately demonstrate their methods of communication and coordination. Their actions suggested not just intelligence, but a conscious desire to share their knowledge with humans who proved worthy of trust. Mike's role evolved as well. His photographs and documentation became part of an educational program that spread far beyond their small community. He began working with indigenous communities worldwide, helping them document and protect their own sacred connections with wildlife. The mother bear's lessons, it seemed, had universal applications. The cub, now nearly grown, developed its own unique way of interacting with humans. Unlike its mother's solemn demonstrations, the young bear showed playful creativity in its communications, often adding what appeared to be artistic flourishes to the traditional warning marks. This unexpected development suggested the partnership between bears and humans was not static, but evolving with each generation. As summer turned to autumn, the forest showed signs of healing from the corporation's preliminary work. The guardian bears led efforts to restore damaged areas, showing humans which plants to cultivate and which spaces to leave untouched. Their ancient knowledge of the ecosystem proved more effective than modern restoration techniques alone. The mother bear's original rescue of her cub now seemed like a distant memory, yet Mike often reflected on how that single act of compassion had sparked such monumental changes. The bears had tested his courage that day, judging whether he was worthy of becoming part of their ancient tradition of guardianship. By saving one small life, he had helped protect an entire ecosystem and revive an ancient partnership between species. Late one evening, as Mike sat on his cabin porch reviewing his latest photographs, the mother bear appeared with her nearly grown cub. They approached closer than ever before, and in the fading light, Mike saw something in their eyes that transcended the usual barrier between human and animal consciousness. It was a look of shared purpose, of mutual understanding that went beyond words or symbols. They were no longer just photographer and subjects, but fellow guardians of a sacred trust that stretched back through time immemorial. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.